Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the video. My name's Ashley, and for those who are new here, this channel is all about oil painting, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the tips and techniques that I use in my painting process. So I paint all kinds of things, but I tend to focus on portraits, landscapes and wildlife, and I will be covering all of those in upcoming videos. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, then please hit that subscribe button and also the notification icon so you won't miss any of those videos. So yeah, with that said, let's get right into the video. Okay, so for this video I'm going to be focusing on the human figure and more specifically on painting skin tones. I'm working on a 30 by 24 inch canvas and I'm using Winsor & Newton oil colours. I have actually posted a full time-lapse of this painting previously, but as I still had the footage for it, I thought I'd make a tutorial for you guys. So the first step is the blocking in stage, and this is what I'm working on right now. From looking at the reference photo, I've pre-mixed a few skin tones, and these don't have to be anywhere near exact, but they will help me define the basic shapes. The main thing that I'm trying to do with the blocking is to lay down the tonal range so that the lights and darks are in the correct place. For this, you've got to have a good understanding of where the light sources are coming from. So in this picture, the main light source is coming from the top left hand side, and this is casting a warm yellow light. But I've also noticed that there is a less intense, cooler light coming from the right hand side, which is casting a muted blue glow on the figure's side. I'm also not too fussed about the actual colours I'm putting down right now, so long as they're not completely off. The other thing I'm trying to remember is also to preserve my tones. The lightest I can go is pure white, so I don't want to go anywhere near that at this stage of the painting. Even though they appear white, the colours that I'm using right now for the highlighted areas are mainly yellow ochre with a bit of burnt umber and titanium white. It's just that comparatively to the dark background, the colour seems really bright. Okay, so moving on to the head, this is actually the part which was the hardest for me to get right. As you'll see later on in the video, I struggled quite a lot. And because the figure is quite small, it was very difficult to sculpt the planes of the face correctly. But again, right now I'm just focusing on getting the lights and darks in the correct place. So I'm laying down quite bold marks and then softly blending those together. When working on such a small area, it's very easy to use too much paint, which will result in that area getting too wet and muddy, so it becomes impossible to work on. So if I feel that there is too much paint on the brush, I will softly wipe on a paper towel to remove the excess before I apply it to the canvas. If it does get too wet and it's not blending properly, then you can just use a paper towel to wipe the area on the canvas. If you do this, you may find that it will completely smudge that area, so you'll have to rework it. Alternatively, you could just wait a day or so for it to become touch dry and then work on another section while you're waiting. So there are a couple of options. Okay, so now that the blocking is done, I can start refining the figure. I'm going to start with the skin tones again, so I've pre-mixed some colours that I think I might need. I like to have a lot of vibrancy in my work, so I tend to exaggerate colours quite a lot, and I use a lot of deep reds and oranges balanced with more neutral tones. I've also got some light blues and purples mixed for the cool reflective light coming from the right hand side. These are comprised of ultramarine blue, titanium white and a touch of quinacridone magenta. Now these colours are just rough and I'll probably change them as I work when I see how they look on the canvas, but they do provide a good starting point. As you can see, I'm working on the head right now, and very much like how I did the blocking, I'm using a small flathead brush to lay down fairly broad blocks of colour and then softly blend those outward after wiping the brush clean. I was thinking that the skin tones that I laid down during the blocking stage were too yellow, so with this layer I tried to mix more reddish colours. After working on it for a while, I realised that I had gone too far and the face had way too much pink in it. This area has also become too wet, so it's now quite difficult to work on. So I used a paper towel to wipe away some of the paint. Luckily it's not too wet, so when I wiped it, it didn't smudge too badly. So to fix the pinkiness, I have added burnt umber, ultramarine blue along with yellow ochre to the mixes, and this will hopefully balance the colours out with more earthy tones. I've also started using my liner brush to give me a little more control as I'm working. So I'm working back and forth, making sure not to use too much paint, and I'm paying very close attention to my reference photo as I do this. This definitely won't be the final layer, as I think the overall colour is still too pink. What I'm trying to do here is define the features a little more so I know exactly where the nose, mouth and eyes will be. There is also something bugging me about the face shape, so I'll have to revisit that at some point as well. Okay, so I'm going to leave the face as it is for now and move on to working on the rest of the body. I reverted to using the flathead brush as this is a larger area, and I start by putting in some of these shadow areas. There wasn't much contrast in the block-in, so we definitely want to increase the tonal range. For the underside of the arm, I am using a mix of alizarin crimson with burnt umber and a small amount of ultramarine blue. I then make another lighter mark to indicate where the highlight will be, which from looking at the reference photo will actually be in the middle of the arm. This is coming from the cool reflective light, so the mix for this is titanium white, quinacridone magenta and ultramarine blue. I then blend that upwards into more warm colours, which includes yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. So the main light source is hitting the hand and the forearm, so the main colours I use here are yellow ochre, alizarin crimson and of course titanium white. Moving to the other arm, the process is mainly the same. I'm laying down the main blocks of colour first and then softly blending those together. What I think is working really well is that bright orangey red colour that I'm using on the sides of the arm is kind of creating this warm glow on the skin, which I think is really effective. I also have my cool highlight colour, which I put on the outside of the arm using a liner brush, and this reflective light really helps round out the form. The legs are mainly in shadow, which is caused by the dress, so the colours I use here are going to be quite dark and muted. There is, however, some reflective light bouncing off the dress, which casts some nice red colours on the back of the legs. Now the lighting on the leg is actually quite complicated, and honestly there is no way I'd be able to imagine the effects the lighting has here, so it's important to look very closely at your reference and be able to break down what you're seeing into colour zones. So again, I'm trying not to use too much paint while I lay in some of the dark shadows, which includes cadmium red deep, burnt umber and ivory black. I then put in a dark reddish brown colour to the left, which has a very subtle cool highlight just before it meets the dark shadow. I can then softly blend these together, and as I haven't used too much paint, it should just diffuse the edges slightly without losing the colour definition. If you do blend it too much, you can just add a little more paint to redefine it and then do the same again. I then put in another dark shadow caused by the edge of the dress following the curvature of the leg, but I didn't extend this all the way as there is a subtle red reflective light on that side. It's still very dark, so I mix a deep red comprised of cadmium red deep and alizarin crimson. As it blends to the shadow, it will appear very dark, even though I haven't darkened those reds at all. How you perceive colours is often very dependent on the colours that are around it. On the right hand side of the leg, I add in some of the warm skin tones that I used on the upper body, and this will help create some harmony so it doesn't seem like two separate things, if that makes sense. And to the right of that, I put in the cool reflective light. As I put these colours in, I blend it with the surrounding areas. I'm deepening the tones, and I also put in a much more vivid red reflective light, which is almost the same colour as the dress. It's just a case of putting in the lights and darks where I see them on the reference. As the colours of the blocking were quite muted, the lighter and darker colours that I put down now have quite an impact and have a lot of definition. But I still haven't used my brightest or darkest colours yet, so if I wanted to increase the tonal dynamic in the next layer, I still have the means to do so. So like the rest of the figure, I make bold strokes defining where the lights and darks are, and I'm constantly aware of the temperature of the colours I'm using. I've got to determine whether the light that is cast is warm or cool. So I'm using a mid-tone for the areas in between, and using that to blend across those areas. From here, it's a case of making minor adjustments and subtle variations to achieve a realistic look. The knee was quite challenging, and to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure what was going on there. There appeared to be a shadow underneath and above the kneecap, with some cool highlight lighting up the edge, but I just followed the colours I could see in my reference photo to get similar shapes, and it ended up looking okay. This actually went pretty well for just the second layer. Normally I use like 5 or 6 layers before I'm happy. So we'll see how this dries, and it may be fine as it is, or maybe I just put in one more layer or so. Moving back to the upper body now, I start highlighting some of the areas on the chest, which didn't get highlighted as much as the arms did. This is actually the next day, so I'm working over dry paint. I'm being quite hesitant here, and I'm making just small marks of where I want the highlights to be. I'm using what I believe is called a scumbling technique, which is basically how you get soft transitions when working wet over dry. The idea is to spread the paint out so it gets thinner and thinner, and the thinner the paint is, the more of what is underneath will show through. With this technique, it's better to use less paint, as you can always add more if it is thin too much, If you add too much from the start, you may find that it won't thin quickly enough in the area that you want, so you won't get a smooth transition. Hands are always difficult to paint as there are so many joints and angles to them, and in this painting it's even harder as we're working on such a small area. I already have some definition there from the first and second layers, but it still needs a lot more refinement. I have about 5 shades mixed on the palette for this, and I start by adding in the shadow side of the index finger. And this is quite a vibrant red as the fingers are quite thin, so the light can shine completely through them. And what this does, it illuminates the blood underneath, creating the red glow. Unfortunately, this is merging into the dress, so there is a highlight color on the underside to separate it. I do the same with the other fingers, but I'm also using another shadow color that is a bit darker for the areas where the light doesn't shine through as much. This shadow color is darker and less saturated, and also by using this in contrast, the reds will stand out more. I'm also not forgetting about the cool light, which is highlighting the underside of the hand, and this really helps to separate the shapes of the hand that are in deep shadow. I realized that I had made the hand a little too wide, so I quickly mixed up a dark blue shade to match the color of the clothing underneath, and then used that to cut back in on the hand to thin it out a little bit. Okay, so moving back to the face, this is now the third layer, and let's see if I can fix the colors here. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't happy with the general shape of the face, so to begin with, I start by just redefining some of the outlines of the features. Using a dark tone, I put in that ridge that lies just under the nose and above the mouth, and also put in the nostril, and I narrow the side of the nose. Then I reshape the eyebrows and put in the reflective light underneath. The other thing I did was widen the forehead on the right hand side just above the eyebrow. I then go back with the background colour to sharpen and narrow the face on the right hand side. Making these adjustments has made a big difference, and I'm feeling a lot happy about how it's looking. Now I'm going to go ahead and work on colouring the face. I'm thinking I need more warm hues coming through on the left hand side, so I'm going to be mixing oranges, yellows and reds. I'm also mindful that the colours I use here have got to match the rest of the skin tones. So like everything else, I lay in broad strokes of colour that I will later blend together. As I was using this bright highlight, which is now very close to pure white, I moved to put in the reflective highlights on the right hand side. Even though it's pretty much the same colour as the highlights on the left, it's still going to appear cooler because of the colours it's surrounded by, which are mainly purples with more blue in them than red. On the left, the highlights will be surrounded by reds, oranges and yellows, so they will appear warmer. So I'm working in zones, and I'm trying very hard to get the balance between the warmer, saturated skin tones with the more neutral tones, which have much more burnt umber in them. I'm working quite slowly, and I often just pause and take a step back to see if it's working. When I focus on a certain area for too long, I find I lose sight of how it looks in comparison to the things around it. So by taking a step back, you can view the painting as a whole and really get a sense of what's working and what's not working. Now working on the ear was very tricky as there are just so many shapes to it, and as I'm working on such a small area, it was nearly impossible to be able to define them. In the end, I simplified it to the larger shapes and used high tonal contrast to define them. As the ear is quite thin, it allows the light to really shine through and illuminate the blood underneath, and this creates a warm orange glow in certain areas, so I make sure to put those in. After finishing the first layer of the background, I left it to dry for a day or so. When I came back to it, I thought that the skin tones had become quite dull and yellow, so I mixed together a few lighter shades, and this is very close to the top of my tonal range. It's a mixture of vermilion and cadmium yellow pale, with mainly titanium white. I start off by using that scumbling technique, so I'm not using that much paint here, and then I'm spreading it out to diffuse the edges. I have mixed some of the other colours, so if I put in too much white, I can go back to reduce some of the highlights. In the end, I pretty much covered the whole area in paint, so I ended up working wet on wet. And when I mixed the skin tones this time, I used a little more vermilion so that it wouldn't end up too yellow like the previous layer. And although I make it seem like I did something wrong in the previous layers, It's actually very important that I build up these layers so that I have the right foundation to get the desired results. So it's not like they were mistakes, and I don't think I'd be able to get it like this from the outset. But I know that there are some artists who can paint really well with just one layer and get some really realistic results. But for the way I work, building it up with layers of refinement is what works best for me. During this stage, I did notice one change that needs to be made to the shape of the torso. I just need to narrow where the arm joins onto the main body. So I go in with a liner brush and draw a faint line to indicate where the new edge will be. When I go over the background again, I will make sure to go right up to this new line. The legs definitely needed a bit of extra work. I felt that the closest leg was a little too wide at the top, so I just cut back into it to reshape the edge. Now the back leg had become quite matte and had faded a bit, so it kind of merged into the folds of the dress. To redefine it, I mixed a dark red colour with alizarin crimson and ivory black, but most importantly, I thinned the paint out with Liquin Original, and this will allow the tones underneath to show through more. The other thing it does is you'll find that the paint will spread further than it would normally, and this medium is also good because it is fast drying. I'm going over the whole leg to try and bring back some of that colour. The front leg is also dried fairly matte, so I do the same thing here, thinning the paint out and applying glazes. When mixing these glazes, I'm using very rich colours and hopefully it will just tint the tones that are already there and not completely cover it. I don't have very much on the brush as a little goes a long way. Now I'm not entirely using glazes here, and for the lighter areas and some of the midtones, I'm lightly dry brushing over the surface. And the reason for this is that you can't glaze over something to try and highlight it. What I've found is that when you mix a whitish glaze, the result you get is that the colour you're applying it over will just appear very hazy, like there's a mist over it. And this is also why I used the scumbling technique previously when I was highlighting the skin tones. However, glazes are great at darkening and tinting colours, which is what I'm using it for here. Like all my paintings, this is a learning process for me. I never do a painting where I know exactly what to do from the start and it all goes perfectly, and I don't believe that happens for many artists either. I do have a general process of an initial sketch, then block-in, and then refinements, but it's all a process of trial and error and analysing what's working and what's not working. The key part is knowing how to fix what's not working, and I've been thinking that this is one of the main things that I've improved at after practicing for a while. So here's how it looks when you've got a decent camera on it, and I'm really liking how all the colours came out. I'm not sure exactly how long I spent painting this, but I probably had it on the easel for about 2 weeks. So it is a lengthy process. It ended up having many steps to it, but I think the result we got was well worth it. But yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you next time.